you're going to talk about the origin of life, it's necessary to talk about what life is. And we already defined the characteristics of life in the first lecture of the year on the Nature of Life lecture series. But we know that the simplest example of life is the cell, which is basically a membrane with some genetic material inside and perhaps some mechanisms to perform basic chemical activities, which we call metabolic processes, which make it grow, develop, and reproduce. And over time, that tends to evolve over many generations of the reproduction process. Now, all of these basic characteristics of living things are dependent on what life is actually built with. Because if you look closer on that membrane, you're going to realize it's made up of lipids. And if you look closely at the genetic material, you're going to see it's made up of DNA and RNA, which are nucleic acids. And those machines that perform the metabolic activities are usually proteins, which require energy from carbohydrates. These are the molecules of life. And there's a whole field of study in biology that's called molecular biology, which is concerned with studying these molecules of life. It is the smallest level at which biologists study life, because even though life does not start until the cellular level, it is built of these molecules. So it's necessary to understand these molecules to understand the way that life works. So if you want to talk about the way that life starts, it's first important to talk about where these molecules come from. Now, these molecules are basically organic molecules, compounds made mostly of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and then some other elements like nitrogen, sulfur, and phosphorus. Now, these organic compounds are usually associated with life, and that's what's intriguing. Because if you need organic compounds to have life, but you need life to have organic compounds, then you can come up to the conclusion that it's impossible for life to exist without pre-existing life. That you would have to need life for life to come from, since organic compounds come from life. The problem with that argument is that there's plenty of examples of organic compounds on the world without life. In other words, organic compounds that did not come from life. In fact, there's even organic compounds in space where life is not present, in things like comets and other things like that. So this means that it is possible for life to have evolved from organic compounds that evolved prior to the existence of life. And so scientists since the beginning of the 20th century have been studying how could that possibly have happened. The first one, and one of those pioneer scientists, was called A.I. Operan. And what Operan suggested is that early atmosphere, which was overall reducing in nature. And the compounds which constituted this atmosphere was most likely hydrogen, methane, ammonia, water, nitrogen, and small amounts of carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, and hydrogen sulfide. Compounds that came from the volcanic eruptions of the volcanoes of the early Earth. Now, it's very important for the atmosphere to be like that in the beginning, because the thing is, if the atmosphere in the beginning was the way it is today, the processes of abiogenesis will probably not have happened. Because the thing is, the chemistry of what's required to happen during abiogenesis requires an atmosphere that does not have too much oxygen in it. The thing about an atmosphere full of oxygen is that it's oxidizing in nature, and that would actually prevent the reactions that are necessary for the origin of life. But that's okay, because oxygen in the atmosphere doesn't even make sense before life, because life is the source of the oxygen. Cyanobacteria, algae, and plants are the things that put oxygen in the atmosphere, and that all of those things are alive. So the early atmosphere probably did not have oxygen. And that's corroborated by the geological evidence from rocks, which suggests that ancient rocks from before the period of life actually did not have oxygen in them. And only later, rocks start becoming rich in oxygen. So that means that, indeed, the early atmosphere may have been a reducing agent, and that actually facilitates the formation of the chemicals necessary for life. Also facilitating that formation is the presence of ultraviolet radiation and lightning as a source of energy for the combination of smaller molecules into bigger molecules. See, the lightning provides the energy necessary for building bigger molecules from smaller molecules. And lightning was a common event in the early Earth because of all the eruptions of volcanoes, and all the early life cycle of the early violent atmosphere allowed the formation of these lightnings to be a common thing. It was a polarized, full of ions and things like that, so lightning was very common. Now, ultraviolet radiation was also going to be common, because since you did not have oxygen, you did not have ozone. And without the ozone layer, ultraviolet radiation would penetrate all the way to the land. And only in the water would these chemicals be protected from lightning and from the effect of ultraviolet radiation. And that's where another scientist comes in. Working off the ideas from Operan, another scientist called Haldane came up with the idea of the primordial soup, which you've probably heard about before. The idea is that the shallow oceans of the world provided environments to protect the early chemicals necessary for the generation of life from the dangerous area of the lightning and ultraviolet radiation from the atmosphere. Because although it's true that lightning and ultraviolet radiation provide the energy for the formation of the early chemicals from simpler chemicals, it is also the same thing that could possibly destroy the same chemicals. In other words, the same lightning that creates the early molecules of life would have destroyed it the next second, if it wasn't for the possibility that at least some of those elements may have rained out into the oceans and found protection in the waters of the oceans, underneath rocks, and deeper into the oceans from those same processes. So, this primordial soup is then the idea that the oceans of the world contain the building blocks for life, including amino acids and other things like that. But it wasn't until much later that evidence actually came from laboratory experiments to prove that indeed this was a possible thing. The first experiment to show that this was possible was performed by two scientists that you see in these pictures called Miller and Urey. Now, the Miller-Urey experiment created a model of the early atmosphere of the Earth. Basically, they had a chamber, that you see in the top right of the drawing, full of methane gas, ammonia gas, hydrogen gas, and water vapor. And then you have an electrode to simulate the effects of lightning. And this electrode provided energy to break apart the elements on those simple molecules and recombine them into more complex molecules. And then these molecules were removed from the atmosphere through the condenser, which is the simulating rain, and then they would fall into a pool in the bottom that contained these organic compounds, and then dripped out to a sample vial. And then they analyzed what was in that sample vial, and lo and behold, they actually found the presence of amino acids and other types of simple organic molecules like lipids formed spontaneously from the lightning generated by the electrodes in an environment that simulated the environment suggested by Operant. So what you see here is a combination of what both Operant and Haldane said. Operant said the atmosphere was like this, that's what they put there, and Haldane said it was going to be a primordial soup, and that's what you see in the bottom there. Now, they also simulated the evaporation, which completes the water cycle and returns the vapor back to the atmosphere, carrying maybe some of the molecules which were created in the process as well. Now, remember that there are criticisms to this, because the biggest criticism is that Miller-Urrey failed to create life in their experiment. And I love how ridiculous that criticism is, because Miller and Urrey were not setting out to prove the origin of life. They just wanted to prove that it was possible for organic compounds to organize themselves without the presence of life. In other words, that it was possible to spontaneously generate organic compounds even without life. And that's exactly what they did. To say that they failed at creating life would be like saying just because all they can do is build a shack, it means that it's impossible to build the Empire State Building. Well, maybe it's impossible for me, but not for in general. They were not setting out to prove abiogenesis, which was much more complex than what they were actually setting out to prove. They just wanted to see if it was possible for complex molecules to be generated in the laboratory with spontaneous events based on Operant's and Haldane's ideas. Now, a good, valid criticism is the idea that maybe in the early Earth there was nothing to protect the chemicals which were generated from the atmosphere the way that it was in their experiments. Because you see, as soon as the molecule was generated, the condenser kind of sucked it out of the solution and put it back into the primordial soup in the bottom, which were then analyzed. But maybe in the early Earth that did not happen. You know, there's one moment the lightning makes the chemical, the moment after the lightning destroys it. So newer experiments have addressed that limitation and actually kept several times. They would do the lightning several times before they actually try to collect something out of it, and they still found the formation of amino acids, proving that it is not necessary to immediately remove the chemicals from the atmosphere in order to make that happen. But remember, the idea here is that yes, it's true that the same lightning that creates the chemicals would also destroy it, and the same ultraviolet light will also destroy it, but as long as a little bit was created and rained out into the oceans and found protection from those processes, then over long periods of time enough would gather in the oceans to become a primordial soup, which would then lead to the conditions necessary for life to occur. Another great criticism of this is that perhaps the early atmosphere was not reducing in the way that Operant said. What if the chemicals that are wrong? Well, Then what scientists did is they used several different versions of the primordial soup, several different versions of the early chemicals, and including versions which were oxidizing in nature, even though we think it's not like that. But even in oxidizing environments, scientists still generated amino acids out of the same kind of setups that Miller-Urrey used decades ago. And in addition to all of this, ultimate proof for this process comes from the fact that today, if you go to areas where volcanic eruptions are taking place and volcanoes are spilling out gases like methane and helium and hydrogen and nitrogen and water vapor and ammonia and all of these things which would suggest were present in the early Earth, if you take samples of those fumes, you will find amino acids in those fumes. So, in other words, data collected from experiments such as the Miller-Urrey experiments and other variations of it have identified that it's possible for organic compounds to form spontaneously given the proper conditions, governed by natural processes even in the absence of life. And this will happen even in oxidizing environments, and we have actually seen it happen near volcanic vents. But to go from that to the generation of complex macromolecules such as proteins seems to be a large leap of faith. But remember, it is not necessary to generate the complex molecules that we see today. To jumpstart the process of evolution, all you need is a simple macromolecule, maybe a polypeptide that has 3 amino acids in length. And the chances of that are not that small, and we've actually shown that that's possible even without the life. One experiment that did that is based on montmorillonite rocks made of clay. Now, these clay rocks are very common near volcanic vents. Now, what happens is that the volcanic vent heats up the clay. What scientists did is that they dripped amino acid-rich solution on top of these rocks, and the heat of the clay near the volcanic vent actually served as a catalyst for the formation of spontaneously generation of strings of amino acids, which were basically polypeptides or simple proteins. In other words, a natural process which has nothing to do with life, just spontaneously generated, just basic simple thermodynamics, generated a complex molecule built of strings of amino acids. So scientists have also identified evidence that natural processes could have led to the formation of strings of amino acids in the early Earth. Now, on top of that, you have panspermia and transpermia. Even if you're not willing to accept the idea that organic molecules could have been generated on Earth, you could also have the fact that in the space, the cosmos is full of organic chemistry. Comets, meteorites, moons, and planets of our solar system are full of organic compounds, even though out there in the cosmos we have not yet found the presence of life. And these organic compounds are there because of other natural processes that have nothing to do with life. And when these comets and meteorites hit the Earth, they bring with them these organic compounds. One meteorite is famous. It's called the Murchison meteorite. It's full of amino acids, such as the amino acids that exist today on Earth. So that indicates that the organic compounds that are on life today could have perhaps come from outer space. So that even if you could not have the formation of abiogenesis generation of simple organic molecules or of complex macromolecules, perhaps these macromolecules could have come from outer space and or from other places where life was already possible. You could even stretch it to say that life itself came from other planets and that our planet was seeded either by a highly advanced civilization or accidentally through a comet transfer. But even without going that far, the fact is when comets and meteorites come from outer space, some of them may have organic compounds in them, and that may have been the source of the organic compounds that we see on Earth today. So, combined results from the experiments, such as the Miller-Urrey experiment and variations of it, experiments that prove that it's possible for you to form complex molecules from stringing of simple organic compounds just by spontaneous generation, and the possibility of transpermia and panspermia, as observed by comets today that have organic compounds in them, suggests an early Earth that indeed has the primordial soup that Haldane described, full of the building blocks necessary for life. So all you need now is a process to take it from that to life. And we'll talk about how that worked in another video. I'll see you then.